Our speaker today is Julie K. Strong, a recently retired physician living in Halifax. And she has an ongoing shamanic practice. Her debut novel, The Tudor Prophecy, that you can see over here, is just published this year, is the first in a trilogy. Aren't we lucky? Copies of the books will be available for sale and signing after the talk. So thank you again for coming, and over to you, Julie.
Well, thank you, Margie, for the introduction and for the promise of treats. And thank you all for coming out on a wet afternoon to this talk on Queen Elizabeth I, and also to people who may be watching from their homes or wherever may be. And thank you to Barb Cottrell and Scans for inviting me to do this, Mark for organizing, and Bill for tech, and that swoonable last dude who played the Merry, Merry Month of May. My talk is about an hour, and then we have a 50-minute coffee break, and then come back for 50 minutes of Q&A, and then to have book sales and signing for the last 20 minutes or so. And this is my first slide. This is called the rainbow slide. This would have been when Queen Elizabeth was, about 50. I mean, she never aged beyond 22, but here you have her in her glory and holding a rainbow in her right hand because of Iris, the messenger goddess of the ancient Greeks. Her emblem was the rainbow. And you can see this fabulous serpent embroidered on her left sleeve. And I learned this year that you don't become queen when they put the crown on your head. You become queen when they come and tell you that the old queen is dead. That would have been Mary Tudor. So they come to Elizabeth and they say, the queen is dead, long live the queen. And this event happened on November the 17th, 1558. So we have an anniversary, and I was doing the math in my head, but I didn't work it out, but here we have. And if you look at the time difference, it would be just around this time that they would be galloping from London to Hatfield to let her know that she was the new queen. So, all right, I knew a lot about her early life because my novel, The Tudor Prophecy, is Elizabeth up to age 14. And in the novel, after many harrowing adventures, one of my heroines meets with the 8-year-old Elizabeth and persuades her that when she comes to the throne, she will rule with mercy. And The Tudor Prophecy makes an excellent present for historical fiction-loving sister-in-laws and difficult-to-please nephews. It has been described as Game of Thrones meets Little Women, and my hope is it will inspire women to triumph over adversity. And it's available here, bookmark, for you watching from afar. Chapters, Bears Lake, and I'm doing a signing there, November the 30th, 1 to 4. That's a Sunday afternoon. So if people came, and if you didn't want to buy the book, I would love to have a chance to be able to talk a bit more about it, because right now this is about Elizabeth. Because my hope in writing a book is that to demonstrate that we all have a sphere of influence. It takes courage to act in the world with love. And this talk about what Elizabeth was able to do despite all the odds against her. All right, another thing I didn't know when I said, sure, I'd like to do this talk, is that Queen Elizabeth I is the most written about British ruler of all time. There are volumes on her, and she is one of the most written about rulers of all time anywhere, coming in after Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon Bonaparte. So there's a huge amount on her. And many features of her reign are the topic of contention. Like, just as I was researching this, just a simple thing. Elizabeth took as her motto the Latin semper eadem, which means always the same, always constant. And this was Anne Boleyn, her mother's motto. And so there's this huge debate that I knew nothing about. She took it because of her mother. No, she didn't take it because of her mother. She took it for some other reason. And people, they can come to quite almost blows about these things. But enough of the blows about people contending about what Elizabeth did or didn't do, because eventually we'll get to the blows that Elizabeth herself inflicted on others. Fortunately, we have some facts about her and her reign, and I've tried to stick to the main ones. Elizabeth, who lived from 1533 to 1603, ruled England, Wales, and Ireland. She also claimed to be Queen of France from 1558 until her death in 1601, although not a square inch of France belonged to England. It's just the way it was. Queen Elizabeth's first reign has come down to us in history as an era of peace and prosperity under a great and mostly benevolent ruler. Her reign stands out in an era where there were not many great benevolent rulers. Certainly there were no other great female benevolent rulers. So these are the topics for consideration. Her early days, which were fraught with danger, her accession to the throne, the religious settlement, the marriage question. Oh, and that's when we get into her very bad behavior. And Mary, Queen of Scots, the exploration. And I have to put the New World in quotation marks nowadays, because it certainly wasn't new to the people what lived here. Spanish Armada, golden age of literature. And here I'm just summarizing some of the reasons why Elizabeth had such a successful rule. And right from the very beginning, she was acknowledged as Henry's heir. And even though Henry had brought the country low with taxes for his unsuccessful wars against France, and despite all the chopping off of heads, the people still loved him. You know, bluff King Hal, thump you on the back, maybe buy you a beer. Narcissus, a psychopath, rather like Trump, and they loved him. Elizabeth was intelligent. She could speak at least 3 languages by the time she was 10. And she was young when she came to the throne, which was just the right age. She wasn't too young, like when her brother Edward comes, he's only 9, or when her older sister Mary comes, who's 37. At 25, she's good. And she gets to rule for 45 years. And longevity equals stability, those times. People knew she was courageous. She had been imprisoned for 2 months in the Tower of London at her sister Queen Mary's instigation. And as you know, the Tower was a dreadful place of torture and execution where Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, had been imprisoned and died. And Elizabeth inspired trust, unlike her father, Henry, who got his way simply by terrifying people. Elizabeth used her femininity when it suited her. And her counselors, especially William Cecil, who was her chief counselor, treated her, I think, in the way a medieval knight would have treated his lady, as being a paragon of virtue, even though he knew Elizabeth wasn't. She was always throwing inkwells at him. But there was lots of disagreement between them, always mutual respect. And I think there was something spiritual about Elizabeth. But I also think that she would laugh at that suggestion. And she would say to me, "God's teeth, woman, are you a lunatic?" Because Elizabeth was all for common sense in religion, finding ways so that people could get on with their lives and not be at each other's throats all the time. And putting her in the context of female rulers and leaders, there was Queen Victoria, who had a long reign, and people tend to think well of her. I think the main problem with Queen Victoria is that all the colonization that went on during her reign, and we still live with the aftermath of that today. And Queen Elizabeth too, well, she saw Britain through the aftermath of the Second World War and was a figurehead of stability for England while the whole world underwent such major technological advances. And then here in Canada, we've had Kim Campbell, but she was short-reigned. The US has nobody. The UK had Margaret Thatcher, and people still kind of quiver and pass out when they hear her name because she single-handedly undermined the social service system of the UK. And we've got recently in New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, who was noted for her empathetic leadership from 217 to 222. She advocated for mental health, climate action, and child welfare. And there's Liberia's Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Africa's first elected female head of state from 2006 to 2018, who promoted gender equality and addressed childhood poverty. So this next, here he is. So this is where we start off with Elizabeth. One of the most notorious kings of all time, captured the imagination even now into the 21st century, dazzled the kingdom with his power, his destruction of the Roman Catholic Church, and his new palaces. Oh, here's a new palace. That's a nice palace. And we know about his 6 wives, and here we have Anne Boleyn. So in 1527, that's when Henry met Anne Boleyn. Henry had already been married for nearly 20 years with an 11-year-old daughter, Mary. But he knew that Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, Mary's mother, would never give him a son. And he could have named Mary as his heir. But the last time in England a king named his daughter as heir was a disaster. It was 1135. It was Matilda, the daughter of Henry I. But Matilda's cousin Stephen contested her claim to the throne, and Matilda had to escape from London on the eve of her coronation. Stephen had all the barons on his side. There was this terrible war, and civil strife lasted 19 years. People in England still remembered the more recent civil war, the War of the Roses, that ended in 1485 when Henry VII, Henry VIII's father, defeated Richard III at Bosworth. And Henry, more than anything, did not want civil war. And to his mind, this meant having a son. So he petitioned the Pope for annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope wouldn't give him the annulment because Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of the Emperor Charles V, and Charles V at some point had the Pope held in captivity, and the Pope was a little worried about Charles V getting cross with him again. So there was no annulment. So Henry, after 7 years of a relationship with Anne, where she was holding up for marriage, took matters into his own hands. He cut from Rome, established himself head of the Church of England, got himself a divorce, and on the 25th of January, 1533, married Anne Boleyn in a clandestine wedding. And he got his divorce, well, he gave himself the divorce from Catherine only in May of that year, and Elizabeth was born in September. So that's just a little bit. So Henry was mortified by Elizabeth's birth, but he figured he had a healthy girl, the next one would be a boy. And then he went about getting the oath of supremacy passed. That was 1534, which says that he's head of the Church of England and that the crown will go to any children that he has by Anne Boleyn. He declares Mary, his elder daughter, a bastard and cuts her out of the succession. And in the beginning, Henry was captivated by Princess Elizabeth. When she was a baby, showed her off. dressed her in expensive baby clothes, and baby Elizabeth had her own establishment. But when Anne went on to have at least one early miscarriage and a later miscarriage where the fetus was identified as male, Henry figured that he was not going to get a son with Anne. So he got Thomas Cromwell, his minister, fixed things. Anne was charged with adultery with 3 courtiers and a musician, also incest with a brother, and treason. And it's treason because adultery meant that she had jeopardized the royal line. She could take any of those 5 people with whom she most definitely did not have intercourse with and present the king with a child. So Anne was found guilty, though very few people believed she was, but she had never been as popular as Catherine of Aragon. And so there's no outcry about her death sentence. The marriage was annulled, and in the end, she was, I guess, glad to be executed with the blade and not burned for treason. So Henry annulled the marriage, and this was of huge importance to Elizabeth because it bastardized her and ruined her marriage prospects. And that was the most important thing to a girl in those times. So whereas before she was useful to Henry as a future eligible spouse for a foreign prince, she was now nothing to him. He saw her very rarely. She only came to his notice when she was 10. And it's hard to know what impression losing Anne Boleyn in that way when she was nearly 3 made on Elizabeth, but she had no clothes to wear. She was totally impoverished and overlooked, and her nursery governess had to write begging letters to Thomas Cromwell for leggings and kirtles and smocks. And it has been suggested that Elizabeth's lack of dresses when she was little resulted in her owning 2,000 at the time when she died. And you just, in the earlier slide, got a taste of what those dresses kind of looked like. And the other fact that I think is significant is that as an adult, Elizabeth's flirtations were almost always with tall, handsome, ambitious, unavailable men, like the singing dude on the lute. She reveled in their attention and flattery as if that could compensate in some way for the neglect of Henry, her father, when she was a child. Mary Tudor, now in her 20s, came to be fond of little Elizabeth, but she never forgave Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, for ruining her own mother, Catherine of Aragon's life. And Mary told people that she thought Elizabeth was Mark Smeaton, the musician who died for committing adultery. Mary said that Mark was Elizabeth's father and not Elizabeth, but that was Mary being myopic because you only had to look at Elizabeth, her red hair, her complexion, her height, and a way of bearing herself that were Henry's own. Mary was prejudiced. Mary was a staunch Catholic, and Elizabeth was being brought up as a Protestant. And later, this would be a huge obstacle between them. Anyway, Henry, soon after Anne's execution, married Jane Seymour, who it seemed tried to form a motherly relationship with Elizabeth. But then, as you know, Jane Seymour died after giving birth to Edward. And this is Edward as a toddler. And I think it's significant that there are no portraits of either Mary or Elizabeth when they were little, before they got cut out of the will and bastardized. They were all about, Henry and his son. So, and Elizabeth would have been about 4 at the time that Jane Seymour died. And it has been suggested that one reason she did not want to marry was from fear of dying in childbirth. Jane Seymour was nearly 30 when she gave birth. That would have been considered old for a first pregnancy. Elizabeth's grandmother, Elizabeth of York, died at age 38 after giving birth to her 8th child. It was expected a queen would give the king as many sons as heirs and daughters as bargaining chips as long as she was able. So after her death, Henry went on to Anne of Cleves, who he took an instant dislike to and divorced her after 6 months. Although Anne spoke very little English, she and Elizabeth had a warm relationship. And Henry, who was now 49, fell in love with Catherine Howard, who was 17 or 18. Nobody ever knew how old the poor girl was. So in the fall of 1541, when Elizabeth turned 8, it was discovered that Catherine had had sexual relationships in the past and that she was carrying on an affair with the groom of Henry's privy chamber. And Catherine was beheaded in February 1542. And all this would have been very hard on Elizabeth, especially as Catherine Howard was executed for adultery, the same crime as Anne Boleyn, and Catherine Howard were second cousins. And Elizabeth at 10 would have understood something of what was going on. She was a very precocious child. She already knew Italian, French, and Latin, and she was learning Welsh from Mistress Blanche Parry, who had been her chief cradle rocker when she was an infant. And Elizabeth was proud of her Welsh background she inherited from her grandfather, first Henry Tudor. Okay, and here we have finally wife number 6. So in 1543, Henry VIII married Catherine Parr. He was hugely obese at that time, dreadful pain with leg ulcers, could barely walk. And Catherine Parr was 30 and been married twice before. And she brought together all 3 of Henry's children as much as it was possible, since they all lived in different households. But Catherine studied Latin with Elizabeth and got her interested in Protestant writings. But most important of all was that Catherine Parr helped persuade Henry to restore both his daughters to the succession. So Mary and Elizabeth remained illegitimate, but they were his heirs after Edward and Edward's children. And in 1544, Henry went to war against France, because he called himself King of France. He did have 2 cities. And so he went to war to recapture Boulogne, which he had lost a bit earlier. But it was terribly expensive. But I think the really good thing for Elizabeth was that while Henry was away, he invested Catherine Parr with the rule of the country. So she was queen regnant. She presided over council meetings and ordered the levying of taxes and the deploying of soldiers that Henry needed in his war effort. And this would have made an impression on the 11-year-old Elizabeth, to experience close hand a woman ruler, to have done it well, not like the dreadful Matilda of the 12th century civil wars. So Henry died at the end of January 1547. Oh, what's he doing here? The villain. Oh, yes. Okay, so Catherine Parr, who married Henry, had been courted by Thomas Seymour before she actually married the king. But Catherine Parr thought that when Henry asked her to marry him, that was her chance to bring Protestantism to the country. So she sacrificed him and married Henry. But Henry died, and only like a few weeks had gone by before he was prowling around under her bedroom window in her dower house at Chelsea. So Thomas Seymour's elder brother, Edward Seymour, is the Lord Protector. Because he's an uncle, he takes charge of young Edward. And this is Princess Elizabeth, her age, nobody's quite sure, 13 or 14. So Elizabeth had gone to live with Catherine, and it seems to have gone quite well, at least from the beginning. Beautiful gardens. She had an excellent tutor, enjoyed archery and oratory, but there was a problem. Thomas Seymour was ambitious, and as you say, very handsome, an eye to the throne. He'd actually asked both Mary Tudor and Elizabeth to marry him before the second time around of asking Catherine Parr to marry him. So while at Chelsea, Seymour would burst in upon Elizabeth while she was still in bed. And Elizabeth now is 14 and is a bit ambivalent about this. She's angry at the insult. She's probably a bit frightened, but she found him exhilarating. You know, Seymour was the handsome, charming rogue. He would strike her on the back or buttocks familiarly, and she would duck away from him. Now, Elizabeth's governess told Catherine Parr that this was not appropriate behavior from a stepfather to a stepdaughter. And Catherine told Seymour, but Seymour went into a rage and said, no, nothing's going on, and just innocent horseplay. And it seems Catherine was not quite convinced, because for a time, when Seymour went to visit Elizabeth first thing in the morning in her bedchamber, Catherine would come too. But then something very odd happened. And there's this event where Elizabeth was just walking around in the garden when she came across Catherine and Thomas Seymour. And Thomas Seymour had a pair of shears and clipped away at Elizabeth's dress. And Catherine Parr actually held Elizabeth while Thomas Seymour was clipping away until she's basically in her undies. And like people looking out the window, people walking, like it was in full. Anyway, it's bizarre. So, and the bedroom romping went on. Catherine became pregnant and turned a blind eye to that. And there's no record that states that Seymour raped Elizabeth, but I think it's more than likely, because she would have been confused. Like 14 nowadays is definitely below the age of consent. But back then it was common for women, especially noble women, to marry at that age, even younger. Henry VII's mother was 13 when she gave birth to him. But it was heinous of a stepfather to act in this way, I think. And also, Elizabeth would be aware of the Third Succession Act of 1544, which stated that the marriage of a princess of the blood to anyone had to have council permission. And she would have known that intercourse with Seymour would have constituted treason. And she wouldn't have told anybody that. She loved her stepmother. She wouldn't have told Catherine. And she could be pretty sure that Seymour would never tell anyone, because he would have committed treason too. And it would. So Elizabeth was terrified, I think, violated as well as in fear for her life. And eventually, and fear that someone would eventually find out. And my conjecture, which is in the sequel for the Tudor prophecy, revolves around the loss of Elizabeth's maidenhead and its mysterious restitution. That will be the princess. So in June, when Catherine was 6 months pregnant, she actually found Elizabeth and Seymour embracing. Catherine banished Elizabeth to Cheshunt. And then, but actually they still exchanged friendly letters, Catherine and Elizabeth. Anyway, then in September, age 35, Catherine died after giving birth to a little girl, Mary, and the little girl only lived till she was 2. And Elizabeth, 15, returns to Hatfield, where she started out. She's a wealthy woman in her own right, thanks to Henry's will. She continues her studies. Cicero, she loves Cicero, and oratory. She really loves oratory. But things start to go badly for Thomas Seymour. He tries to take control of young Edward VI. He's arrested. And one of the things that Thomas is accused of is plotting to marry Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is interrogated about her relationship with Thomas. Elizabeth denies everything, but her governess, Cat Astley, and Thomas Parry, her state manager, are imprisoned in the Tower, and they tell everything they know. The early morning romps in the bedroom, how Elizabeth blushed every time Thomas Seymour's name was mentioned. And Elizabeth's examiner said, I see it in her eyes, she is guilty. But Elizabeth, by shrewd evasion, was able to avoid being implicated and was not tried for treason. Seymour was, though, and was beheaded in March 1549, left Elizabeth a free woman, but I think she was scarred emotionally on several levels. It was bandied about that she had given birth to a child and that Seymour was its father, and that the child had either been murdered or whisked away somewhere in the middle of the night. So she realized she must be very careful to preserve what was left of her reputation. And so for the next 2 years, she wore very plain clothes, black and white. But I think she was fully aware that with her red hair and her dark eyes, black and white looked really, really good on her. So but I do think this traumatic experience made her wary of entering a closer relationship with a man. Flirting would be fine once she was queen, but Seymour had imperiled her life, and she was not going to let down her guard again for a man. So this is Edward VI. And apparently he was healthy up until the age of 14 when he caught measles. And he never fully recovered and died in July 1553 of pneumonia. And during his reign, the country had become strongly Protestant. All paintings and statues removed from churches, only the English Bible was allowed. And when he died, he ignores Mary's claim and Elizabeth's claim, which would have been what Henry VIII's will was. And he goes straight to his Aunt Mary's granddaughters. And nobody is really quite sure. Maybe it was because they were restored to the succession, but they were never legitimized. Anyway, so this means that the crown went to Lady Jane Grey, who, as you know, didn't last very long, 9 days. And Queen Mary rallied her forces and put Jane Grey and her husband in the Tower, and also their father, who was the Duke of Northumberland, and also one Robert Dudley, one of Northumberland's sons, who is going to become that terrible rogue, the Earl of Leicester. Again, looking very much like what Bill kindly put on, that handsome dude in the doublet and the tight hose. Oh, so nice. So anyway, this is Mary. Yes. And so Elizabeth and Robert Dudley meet in the Tower. And Mary became queen in October 1553. And a special act of parliament had to be passed. It was called the Queen's Regent Prerogative Act in 1554. It declared that the royal power was as fully and absolutely in Queen Mary as it had been in any male king. And of course, this would be important to Elizabeth when she begins her rule, because in Elizabeth's mind, she is more king of England than its queen. So the first thing Mary did was to revalidate the marriage of her father, Henry, and her mother, Catherine Aragon, which meant she was now legitimate, and therefore Elizabeth could not be. There was only so much legitimacy to go around, and Mary seized it all. And then she tried to restore Catholicism. But most important question in people's mind were, who was she going to marry to give the country a son to be the next king? Because nobody wanted a queen. And so this is the Tower of London, and it's from the 16th century. And who we got? This is Philip. But people weren't happy about having Philip as a king, because the weird thing is that even though Mary was the Queen of England, if her husband said she had to do something, she had to do it. So this is what happened. Philip told Mary, "You're going to fight against France." And so Mary went and fought and lost. And so she became very unpopular. Of course, she did persecute Protestants, and hundreds were burnt at the stake. And she wasn't unkind. In fact, she was very tender-hearted. But she thought that heresy, Protestantism, was a dreadful infection, and it had to be eliminated before it infected the whole country. So that's the way she did it, was burning. So there was this uprising in 1544, the Wyatt uprising, to assassinate Mary and put Elizabeth on the throne instead. And under guise of keeping her from harm, Mary sent a letter to Elizabeth to come and stay with Mary for her own protection. But the intent was to arrest her as soon as she arrived and put her in the Tower. But William Cecil came to Elizabeth and said, "Don't go, because they say they're just going to protect you, but they're going to put you in this place." And Elizabeth listened to Cecil and said that she was too sick to travel. So eventually Mary sent a litter for Elizabeth and took her to one of the palaces. And there was no proof that Elizabeth was implicated in the Wyatt rebellion, but nobody wanted to be responsible for Elizabeth's safekeeping keeping. So she ended up in the Tower anyway. So, and so it was terrifying for her because she had to go through Traitor's Gate just the way her mum did. So anyway, she was only there for 2 months. Then she went to Woodstock. And in one of the windows at Woodstock, she engraved, "Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be, quoth Elizabeth, prisoner." And in April 1555, she was summoned to attend Mary, who was allegedly pregnant, but Mary wasn't pregnant. And Philip, with an eye to the main chance, knew that his wife, Mary, wasn't long for this world, so decided to kind of court Elizabeth herself, because Elizabeth was better than the other contender, Mary, Queen of Scots, because Philip would rather have his wife, who he could control, on the throne than a French queen, because Mary, Queen of Scots, was also Queen of France. So in October 1555, Elizabeth returned home to Hatfield, still under house arrest, but more liberty, studies, music, out riding. The loss of Calais in January 1558 really did Mary, and she died of heartbreak and another false pregnancy. And maybe she had cancer of the heart, but nobody can agree. And this is Hatfield, where Elizabeth was. And that's where I was when I was able to sit in Elizabeth's chair and have a picture of me with her. And it's so beautiful. And Elizabeth is sitting there. There's so much debate about where she was sitting. But she quotes from the 21st Psalm when they tell her she's the queen. "This is the Lord's doing and is wondrous in our eyes." She formed her first council. William Cecil became her chief advisor. And then this is her coronation. Oh, and this was a source of great grief to me, because I thought, this is so beautiful. This is Elizabeth in all her glory at her coronation when she's 25. This painting was actually done 30 years later, because they did the wood, and they looked at the facial features and just looks nothing at all like Elizabeth. So that was one of my big bubbles burst. So here we go. This is Cecil, who was to become her greatest advisor. And this is Westminster Abbey, where she is crowned. And there was a big problem with her coronation because all the bishops were Catholic and nobody would agree to crown her. So what was she going to do? She had to dig up some remote aged bishop of Colchester, wherever that is, and drag him in. And so he did the ceremony. But and some of it was in Latin and some was in English. And the Protestants weren't happy because of the Latin. The Catholics weren't happy because, anyway, no one is happy. So that's the coronation throne. This is a ring that Elizabeth had made that's got a portrait of herself on one side and a portrait of her mother, Anne Boleyn, on the other. So Philip again, right, because no sooner is she crowned than he comes a wooing. But but for some reason, while she's thinking about it, which she isn't really thinking about, he gives her like 48 hours and then he goes off and marries a Belgian princess. So it wasn't much of her. So Elizabeth inherited a country in a terrible state of poverty from the wars against France. And the first thing she had to do when she did get to the throne was to cure the religious strife that was going on between Protestants and Catholics. She said famously, "I have no mirror to see into men's souls." She had the Protestant religious settlement. Churches had to use the Book of Common Prayer. Everybody was obliged to attend Sunday worship, fined a shilling if they didn't go. Not a huge sum for the wealthier, but it was 2 days' labor for farm worker. Catholics weren't happy. Mass went, saints were downplayed. Robes, candles, incense had to go. On the other hand, the Puritans, the extreme Protestants, were not happy either. They wanted everyone to dress in black and Sunday to be a holy day with no football. But most of the people were okay with Elizabeth's settlement. If there hadn't been a settlement, there would have been civil war. like in France, where between 1562 and 1598, the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants, 2 to 4 million people died. That would have been practically the entire population of England. So the problem was what Elizabeth was to call herself. Henry being the supreme head of the church in England, a woman couldn't be the head. So she became the supreme governor of the Church of England. I thought that sounds kind of all right. And there was relative peace. And so with her suitors, because of course they wanted her to marry, to have a son, to be the king. And another problem, Elizabeth in love with Robert Dudley, who we mentioned, but she was expected to marry a prince. Oh, and by the way, Leicester happened to be married already. And we've got Philip, we've got, this is Eric IV of Sweden. And it's maybe just as well she didn't marry him, because he went on to murder 5 Swedish noblemen, and he died when someone put arsenic in his pea soup. And there was this guy, Hercule, the Count of Alençon, who she called her frog because she was 48 and he was 24. But she was quite fond of him. And in 1581, when he came to visit, she declared she was married to him. But then he went home and she said that no, she wasn't really. But she wore a frog earring in honor of him. So as for her, and now after, at age 50, when people weren't expecting to have a child, she put on all this dreadful white stuff, lead, mercury on her face, and she carried a sieve to prove that she was a virgin, because back in ancient Rome, if the Vestal virgins were accused of losing their virginity, the way they proved that they hadn't was to carry a sieve with water in it. And apparently for one Vestal virgin actually worked, and so this is what Elizabeth is doing. She's proving her virginity. So, and now she was a great huntswoman. She enjoyed shooting deer. She visited the estate of a man whom she disliked. His wife had offended Elizabeth. There had been an auction for a pearl-encrusted lute that Elizabeth especially wanted, and this woman outbid her. Bad move. So when Elizabeth visited the couple, she was shown into the deer field. And normally the monarch would shoot 1 or 2 for ceremony's sake. Elizabeth shot every single deer, and the couple could never afford to refurnish the park. And another of her less endearing qualities was her vanity. Nowhere was it more pronounced than in her relationship with Mary, Queen of Scots. People would come from Scotland and Elizabeth would collar them and say, how tall is Mary? Does she play the lute better than I do? What color is her hair? How well does she dance? Was she pretty? Mary, Queen of Scots, was born in 1542, 6 weeks after the death of her father, James V. She was declared Queen of Scotland. At age 5, she was sent to France to be betrothed to Francis II, who was the son of Henry II and Catherine de' Medici. Henry II died in 1559, and Francis became king, but he died the following year. So Mary returned to Scotland, a widow, aged 18. She was a devout Catholic, but while she was away in France, Scotland had become fiercely Protestant. So that was a problem for her. Another problem for Mary was that in 1565, she married Lord Darnley, who was bad-tempered and feeble-minded. And in 1567, Lord Darnley was assassinated in a gunpowder plot orchestrated by James Boswell. And Mary eloped with James Boswell, who some say he was still married. Some people say he just got divorced. But either way, she was arrested because that was bad behavior and imprisoned. And she was forced to abdicate. And she left James, his son, who'd be later King James I of England, to be brought up by relatives. Mary escaped from prison and fled to England and sought asylum from Elizabeth. But she wasn't happy. And what made things worse, that in 1570, the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth, which meant that any Catholic who to Elizabeth was doing the Pope a favor, because then Mary, Queen of Scots, could be put back on the throne and rule England and Scotland, and everyone would be Catholic and happy again. So there were all these plots to do that. But Elizabeth had a great spy master who discovered the plots, and there was one that Elizabeth could not ignore because it was signed by Mary, giving permission to 6 gentlemen to go and assassinate Elizabeth and put her on the throne. So eventually she is tried. And Elizabeth always felt terribly sad about signing the death warrant for Mary, Queen of Scots. She didn't feel very sad about killing off the 600 people in the Scottish uprising. All the thousands of people will die later on but she was very sad about this. Now, the New World. This is John Cabot, because and as we know, he was employed by Elizabeth's grandfather in 1497 in search of the Western Passage, the Arctic, but he did get to Newfoundland, which he called New Isle, and he may also have come here to Nova Scotia. This again is disputed. But in the early 16th century, America was the uncontested territory of Spain and Portugal. And in the 1560s, a man called Hawkins started interfering with Philip's monopoly on America. Hawkins captured ships and sold the slaves himself. Philip was angry. Queen Elizabeth said, "Such a bad boy, what are we going to do about him?" "Oh, but he's so far away." In 1578, the Queen granted Gilbert, half-brother of Walter Raleigh, a monopoly to discover, find, search, and view such remote, heathen, and barbarous lands, countries, and territories not actually possessed of any Christian prince, which, it makes you think of our land treaty. So he intended to do it. This Gilbert person was going to annex large tracts of Newfoundland. He was backed by Raleigh. He set off in 1580. He got as far as St. John's. He kicked out the Breton cod fishermen there and put this emblem up on a tree and claimed the New World for England, Elizabeth. And Raleigh then petitioned the Queen that he could claim the New World for England, and he was sure that the Queen wouldn't refuse him, because this is where he does his wonderful thing, which is pure apocryphal. But he could be charming, and he got his way. And so the Queen knighted Raleigh, made him Lord and Governor of Virginia, but she wasn't going to give him money. In April 1585, 5 ships sailed out under command of one of Raleigh's friends, and they landed in Roanoke Island. Like, there was 100 that stayed there, and the rest of them sailed home. But in 1586, things weren't good with the indigenous peoples, and there was a threat of famine. And so when Sir Francis Drake was coming back from one of his world expeditions, he picked up the remaining settlers and took them away. And so nobody quite knows. There's a mystery of what happened with Roanoke, last to this day. So defeating the Spanish Armada was the big thing. And that's why Elizabeth couldn't put in any more money or ships into the New World. So Philip of Spain had had enough. Elizabeth's privateers were taking his silver. He saw himself as the King of England because some of his great aunts were relatives of Edward III. And also he was legitimate. And he always thought that that was, something that Elizabeth wasn't. And so the final straw for Philip was Elizabeth sending troops to the Netherlands, which were part of Philip's empire. And so in May of 1588, Philip assembled his armada under the command of Medina Sidonia, 124 ships, galleons, huge vessels, and galleasses, smaller ones. And Elizabeth had 197 ships. Elizabeth had more ships, mainly smaller ones, easier to maneuver. And but for Philip, he also had an army that was mustering in the Netherlands, because the idea was that the Armada would sail up the Channel and meet the Duke of Parma's troops in the Netherlands. And that way they would invade England, both from the south and from the east. But Elizabeth sent Drake to raid the Spanish forces. Drake was able to attack Cadiz. He sent in fire ships and destroyed 30 Spanish ships. But the Armada appeared off the coast, Cornwall, July 29th, in that crescent formation. And these are some of the galleons, and the smaller ones, I believe, are the galleasses. And the English fleet got trapped in Plymouth, but when the weather cleared, the Howard was able to use the small English ships to go after the bigger Armada ships. And the English advantage was that they had these rolling cannons on wheels, and they could be rapidly loaded. So the Spanish way to attack was to broadside an English ship and then put men on board and do hand-to-hand sword fighting. But the British was to just keep bombarding until the ship sank or the sailors gave up, whichever first. And the English plan seemed to work. So, and then this is the fire ships off Calais. And then the Spanish were scattered, and they had to go up around Scotland, where they lost many more of their ships, in Ireland, where they went back to Spain. And so this is Elizabeth's famous speech, but she makes it after the Armada. And I think, oh, ouch. Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that under God I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects. And therefore I am come amongst you, as you see at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved in the midst and heat of battle to live and die among you all, to lay down for my God and for my kingdoms and for my people my honor and blood, even in the dust. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any other prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm. And so deafening cheers and all that. And also her paraphrasing of Julius Caesar, he said, Vini vidi vici, I came, I saw, conquered. And Elizabeth jeered at Philip with Vini vidi fuggi, I came, I saw, and fled. So we're now drawing to the end of Elizabeth's reign. And things seemed rather sad, poor harvest, downturn of the economy, people tired of an old queen who refused to name her successor. But this is the old queen with her hand on the globe. This is the Armada portrait. And in 1594, the queen was 60. She remained slender, could dance vigorous dances until just before she died. And she had terrible teeth. Oh, because she didn't eat much in the way of food, but she loved sweeties, like these comfits, these hard candies with pistachios in them. And so at the end of her reign, she only had 2 teeth left, and they were very black. So, and she could not accept that she was getting old. And then this is Essex, who again is one of these handsome, swaggering dudes, and he's like in his mid-20s. And Elizabeth gave him these military posts, but he wasn't very good. And she sent him to prison for a year, but he came out and gathered other disgruntled folks and wanted to form a new parliament, overthrow Elizabeth. And so that was treason. But I think something that was very significant for him was that a few days before his uprising, he decided to have his friend Lord Southampton put on one of William Shakespeare's play. And it's Richard II, where, a weak king is deposed by a disgruntled noble. And Elizabeth is meant to have said, I am Richard II. And towards Essex, she was weak and knew it. So she realized that he had to go. And for him, and so here we come to one of the greatest legacies of the Elizabethan era, William Shakespeare. The last play that we know that Elizabeth saw was Twelfth Night, and it was staged at court by the Lord Chamberlain's men, and that was Shakespeare's company. And it was put on for the entertainment of the Duke of Orsini, who was visiting from Italy. And at the end of the play, the 68-year-old queen offered to dance for him, and she selected a galliard. And a galliard is something where you leap high in the air, leap high in the air. And Count Orsini was amazed because this was a dance that was hard for 20-year-old women, but here was Elizabeth. She was just leaping away like a yes. So, and then she got the tooth infection. I think she got mastoiditis and she died. But I feel like Dylan Thomas, the Welsh poet, she did not go gently into that good night. So in conclusion, I have to say that Elizabeth had a certain amount of good luck. She had a great chief counselor. She stayed healthy all her life. She had smallpox in 1562, made a full recovery. Many years of good harvest made for a contented people. And she stabilized the religion of England. She used her astuteness to keep suitors, because she kept suitors coming, because she knew that so long as she was interested in a French or a Swedish prince, that Philip of Spain would not attack, because she, of course, would have ally in her husband. But most of all, what I admire in her is a certain humility. She didn't expect everyone to share her personal religious beliefs, like her father, Henry VIII, or like Mary Tudor, her sister, or her brother, Edward VI. And it resulted in her having a certain amount of compassion, I think, for people. So there was beheadings, but no burnings. So finally, I think her legacy is peace. England, most powerful country in Europe, because France decimated by the wars of religion, Spain ruined by failure of the Armada and the drying up of the silver from the New World, the world exploration, the literature, but most of all, I think what commends Elizabeth the most is proof that a woman could rule, and that a woman could rule well. So thank you. So I guess just see yeah, I'll just leave that one up. So I guess we're going to have a break and then come back, and if there's topics for discussion or any questions answered, then I'd be happy to. And thank you all very much for your attention. It was a joy to be able to do this.
Thank you very much, Julie, for your great presentation and exciting interview. I don't know much about this period, but what was the relationship among the royalty in that area? I mean, the different countries, and how did they connect together and work together? Is that something you could comment on?
Okay. The relationship seemed to have been very fraught. Like somebody was always fighting somebody else. Um, like Philip of Spain, he was pretty much a constant for that time, and so he was either fighting France, and of course he wanted to fight England. The French side, oh, that just gave me convolutions because you have Henry II, who's married to Catherine of Medici, and Catherine of Medici seems to have been the mastermind over her three sons, who each rule in turn, none of them for very long or very successfully. And Elizabeth and Catherine of Medici, like, saw themselves as sister queens, but they couldn't possibly get on, especially after 1572, when it seems Catherine of Medici ordered the slaughter of the Huguenots, like the Protestants living in Paris, and that severed relationships with Elizabeth, and then of course with Mary, Queen of Scots, who wasn't content with just being Queen of Scotland. She claimed to be Queen of England as well. So that wasn't a terribly amicable relationship, even before all the husbands and the murders and things. So, but that's as far as I know, like Spain, France, England, and Scotland. And yeah, that's pretty much it. None of them very happy.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your lecture today. In speaking about literature of the time, there are some theories going on now around William Shakespeare and, was he really the prolific writer that he was, or was he just a better businessman? Because there was a lot of sharing of writing and whatnot. And I was wondering if you could just comment on the growth of literature and plays of that time, and whether or not you think William Shakespeare was all that in a bag of chips.
Okay, I think that he did write the plays. Some people say that Christopher Marlowe wrote some of his plays, but I do think that the ones that have come down to us, like Macbeth and Lear and Romeo and Juliet, and the ones that have survived, I do think that there's something inimical about them that seemed to me to have his signature. But when I was looking at him and what he did, because it's not even sure if he and Elizabeth actually met. He had his own company, the Lord Chamberlain's Players, and they did perform for Elizabeth the 12th night. And also he wrote for Elizabeth's court Midsummer Night's Dream, which glorifies the court of Oberon and Titania. But then I thought, it came to me, in that play, Titania, Oberon makes Titania fall in love with this donkey. And would William Shakespeare really have had this performed at Queen Elizabeth, Queen Titania's court, where she falls in love with a donkey? And so I'm starting myself to wonder about things, but I can't really say other than, I do believe he wrote the most famous ones. The ones I don't like The Rape of Lucretia and Troilus and Cressida and Simon and Athens, they can all have been written by Marlowe or anybody else. But I like to think that, and I do think there's something about the way he, as his language, that, yeah. Thank you.
Again, thank you for a marvelous talk. A question about use of words. You referred to a crowning, and I hear the word coronated. And I wondered if you knew if there was any particular reason to use one or the other. I mean, in my word, I would say crown, but people say coronated, and I kind of wondered about that.
Wow, it has been crowning when the reading that I've been doing. I've not come across coronated. Okay, I know it sounds a bit too much like cremated. I think I'll go with crowning. You're welcome.
Thank you. I enjoyed that talk so very much. I wonder if you can comment on your background in family medicine and how you use that to write about Hester, who in current terms, we'd say she had post-traumatic stress disorder, having been sexually assaulted by the king, and Dickie, who had probably epilepsy, and how you incorporated your current modern day thinking with what you surmise would have happened.
Yeah, it's true. Like as a family physician, I could somehow get away with Dickie having the falling sickness. But my daughter, who's an anesthesiologist, said, "Mom, that won't do. The falling sickness is not a diagnosis. You've got to do better than that." But really, it's mind-boggling. If he's going to have the falling sickness, he's damn well going to fall with the sickness. I'm not going to go into his temporal lobes or anything. But what I love about the medicine at that time is how dreadful it was. You know, all there was bloodletting. You fall down on the ground, they take blood from you. You touch your chest, they take blood from you. You have a headache, oh, they take blood from you. Like it's gallstones. Really. But the wise women, they actually did have some remedies that worked. And that's what I go into as to things like feverfew for headache and chamomile compresses for ulcers. And so the wise women had things going for them, whereas the traditional medicine and surgery was barbaric, except the surgeons could pull teeth. And if only Queen Elizabeth had let a surgeon nearby her to pull her teeth, wow, she might have lived to have been 100, but that's the way it is. But no, to answer your question, I haven't really tried to put a modern diagnosis on these, because one of the things that people died of was the lights or the rising. And that was if you got pleurisy, because your lungs were filling up, the lights, the rising. So, because if you go into causes of death in the 1600s, like mostly it's dysentery and plague, but the planets is another thing that will get you. And nobody's quite sure what it is, but it sounds wonderful. So,
any more questions?
So over the years, I've heard different rumors. You know, one rumor was that perhaps she was actually a man, which probably makes no sense. Or I heard the rumor that she always wore those longer sleeve things because perhaps she had an additional finger, or, you know, there's all these crazy things. And I was just wondering in your research, what were one or two perhaps of the unusual rumors or weird things that you came across?
She had very, very long tapering fingers, and she was very proud of them. So if you wanted to curry favor with her, you'd give her a pair of gloves with super, super long fingers. And all the women court started wearing gloves with super, super long fingers, but they had to put cotton wool or something at the end of them so they could actually. So there was that. Like for me, the big thing is whether she was a virgin or not, and I haven't, again, my family medicine hasn't really got me very far in terms of restoring women's hymens. But like I think it could be done, and so I'm looking into that. And in fact, in the next story, Hester. She goes to Paris, where this very famous surgeon, Ambroise Paré, lived. And he did a lot of obstetrical work. He made this wonderful contraption. There was a woman and she was expecting octuplets. Yes. And so he made this like a hula hoop frame to support her abdomen so she could actually walk around and function. And so I'm going to have him that he was able to make forceps, which in actual historical terms doesn't come until the 18th century, but he's going to do it. And he's going to be able to do the minute stitching work that's necessary. And there's going to be a concoction of rum and poppy seed juice and hemlock and some two other things that are going to be sufficient to put Elizabeth knock her out, well, this delicate surgical operation takes place, but she's never going to want to look at a man again.
Just curious, during your phase of research, what did you come across that surprised you the most?
Okay. Oh, well, for this here, I was getting surprised a lot, and not in a good way. So one of the big surprise was that when Philip of Spain wants to invade England, he says, okay, even if the invasion isn't successful and we don't manage to take over England and return her to Catholicism, perhaps Elizabeth, the Queen, will grant equality between Catholics and Protestants. And I thought, whoa, you know, that's from someone who's got the Inquisition and blah, 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 and everything. He wants to have Protestantism and Catholicism side by side. And that was a big shock to me. So it's good that you asked, because I was going to keep that piece of information firmly tucked in. Yeah.
Any more questions?
So that makes me wonder, history is written by the survivors, the victors, etc. So the piece of information that you just mentioned about Philip II, why is that not more widely known? And what does that say about the available sources to anyone doing research?
I don't know, but is Bob Cottrell here? No, she's not. Well, the reason this isn't widely known is because Bob isn't asking people to do lectures on Queen Elizabeth I, because you have to really go digging to get the other side of it. It's shocking. I mean, I'm not a historian. So historians maybe aren't shocked when they come across these terrible, like, travesties of the truth. It's how it can be played with so easily. It makes me wonder what people are going to think in 500 times went up, you know? So I can't really answer further than that. Thank you.
Thank you. Doing a little bit of Google work last night, I was struck by how much intermarriage there was, that people at that level were cousins twice removed, and wondering if that or a genetic problem, which might be encountered with intermarriage, accounted for Henry's health issues, his children's, many of whom died in childbirth or the recurrent miscarriages. What you might say about the hereditary genetic aspects of his health and the health of his wives, I suppose, and the children and miscarriages.
Henry's wives didn't seem, from what I can tell, to be related to him. Like Catherine of Aragon might have been like a fifth or sixth, but terribly far removed, being of the Spanish royal family, and him being Welsh and English. And then Anne Boleyn, I mean, it's true she had miscarriages too, but she was just like a commoner. Like, she wasn't a noble woman that she could have been related. And then Jane Seymour, another commoner. So I can't see that. I mean, one of the things that, and then with Anna Kingswell, they never had, and Catherine Howard never had. And then it's true that as soon as Catherine Parr married Seymour, it only took her like a few months to get pregnant, and she was with Henry for 5 years, but he had all sorts of health problems by then. And one of the things about Henry VIII, though, that people seem to think that he might have had syphilis, and that's why his wives couldn't get pregnant. But I don't think that's the case, because what is available are these long lists of the herbs that were used, like the ground pearls to put on his ulcers. There's long lists of every herb and root and flower that could be used to help cure Henry's ulcers, but there's no mention of mercury. And as you would know, mercury was the only cure that they had for syphilis at that time. So I really don't think that he had that. So that's the one good thing about you. Sorry.
I'm just wondering, what is the significance of the serpent that's embroidered on her clothing?
Yes. Oh, that was on the early one. I don't know. That's the one where she's Iris, like she's the goddess of the rainbow. What I did see was that when she recovered from the smallpox in 1562, they did make these special emblems with Elizabeth's face, because she had to prove to her subjects that she wasn't scarred in any way, although it may be that she was. But this perfect image of her is on a coin, and next to it is a serpent. And so I don't know, the idea was that she has overcome like the serpent of death, or whether in that portrait with the serpent on her sleeve, whether she's embracing like the wisdom that's always associated with a serpent. So I don't know why that should be there, but I would think she has been associated in the past, so she might well want to have that as a, yeah.
Julie, we have a question from one of our members in the Zoom audience. I think I heard that Elizabeth executed more people than Mary. Is that true?
I think it might be, yeah, like because Mary, the number that I have is 264 that she burnt at the stake. She might have executed some others as well, but definitely Elizabeth. There was just the Northern Uprising where she executed 600, and that was, I think, the only big one. And then, of course, there was Essex, and there was Norfolk, and there was a few others. But it's true, she did. All I can say is that she had lots of time, and what else was she going to do? And I do, and I do. But in my heart, I always go to that figure that the religious wars in France, 2 to 4 million people died. That's practically every man, woman, and child in England, if she hadn't have put down her religious settlement when she got crowned. So, yep, there you have it.
Any other questions? Okay, I think I'll hand it over to you.
On behalf of I've done it wrong again. On behalf of everyone here, online and in person, Julie, I want to thank you so much for your presentation. Your insight into Elizabeth and the era is just immense, and we've all learned so much. I especially enjoyed the intrigue, because I compare the intrigue these days to the intrigue then. And, maybe we're a little bit better in some areas and worse in other areas. Yeah. Thank you so much for all the research that you did. Can you imagine how much work she did to write this? It just boggles the mind. And I loved your sense of humor. I hope that's reflected in the book, which I hope to read very soon, and I hope to read the rest of the trilogy. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.